She handed him an apron and pointed at the sink in front of 100 guests and told him the dirty dishes weren't going to wash themselves. She had no idea that the man she had spent 6 years humiliating, ordering around like hired help, and dismissing as a burden, was quietly sitting on a fortune so vast it had once made international headlines. And when the truth finally came out, it didn't just shake her world, it obliterated it. If you've ever wondered what it looks like when a patient man finally stops being patient, stay right here, because this story is one for the ages. If this kind of story keeps you company, hit that like button right now. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it before this video is over. Now, are you watching from New York, London, Lagos, or somewhere else entirely? Or drop your city in the comments. I genuinely love knowing where this community reaches. His name was Daniel Mercer, and for most of the people who knew him in the town of Caldwell Crossing, he was simply Elena's husband. Not a man in his own right, not a professional, or a dreamer, or a person of any particular consequence. Just a quiet, broad-shouldered man who worked at the county's maintenance depot, who drove a 12-year-old pickup truck with a cracked side mirror, and who had the unfortunate habit of being entirely too gentle for his own good. Elena Whitmore Mercer had married Daniel at 26, when she had imagined that love might be enough to build a life on. That fantasy lasted approximately 18 months. By the time their second wedding anniversary passed, Eleanor had quietly recalibrated her ambitions. She had come from a family with very specific ideas about what success looked like. Big houses, European cars, charity galas attended by people whose names appeared in the business section of the paper. Daniel, with his calloused hands and his easy laugh and his complete indifference to social climbing, represented a miscalculation she blamed entirely on youthful sentimentality. The deterioration of the marriage had been so gradual that it was almost invisible, the kind of erosion that doesn't announce itself but simply one day presents you with a canyon where you used to have solid ground. Elena had stopped asking Daniel about his day somewhere around year 2. She had stopped sitting next to him on the sofa in year 3, preferring the armchair near the window where she would scroll her phone in the evenings. By year 4, they had settled into the arrangement of 2 people sharing a space by prior agreement, each conducting their own interior life entirely separately, their interactions reduced to logistics. Who was paying which bill? Who had remembered to schedule the boiler service? Whose turn it was to pick up groceries? Daniel hadn't been entirely passive in this. He had tried in the early years. He had learned which restaurants Elena liked. He had remembered the particular way she took her tea. He had driven 40 minutes on a Saturday to find the specific kind of candle she had mentioned once in passing. These efforts had not gone unnoticed. They had been noticed and then categorized as the sort of thing a man like Daniel would do, which was to say, adequate but not impressive. The word Elena might have used if she were being unguarded, and it was sweet. She would have meant it as something slightly less than a compliment. Her mother, Constance Whitmore, had never bothered to hide her contempt. From the earliest days of the marriage, Constance had referred to Daniel as the maintenance man, not unkindly, she would have insisted, but factually, as though she were cataloguing a piece of furniture that didn't quite match the room. Constance was a woman of tremendous social energy, forever organizing fundraising luncheons and neighborhood association meetings, forever maintaining an elaborate performance of refinement that her actual bank balance only barely supported. Her husband, Elena's father, had died of a heart attack when Elena was 12, leaving behind a modest estate that Constance had spent the 23 years since making stretch as far as dignity would allow. To the commercial strip on Linden Avenue was her primary income. The charity circuit was her primary identity. Neither was as secure as she presented them, but Constance Whitmore was above all else a woman who understood that confidence is its own form of currency. Elena's brother, Preston Whitmore, was cut from the same cloth, but with an extra layer of casual cruelty. Preston worked in commercial real estate and drove a German car he could not quite afford, and he treated Daniel the way a man treats someone he has permanently categorized as beneath him, with a brand of teasing that was always performed in front of an audience, always delivered with a laugh that dared you to take offense. For 6 years, Daniel absorbed all of it. The snide comments at Christmas dinner, the eye rolls when he suggested something, in the way Elena would speak over him in conversations as though his sentences were merely weather, something to be waited out. He went to work. He came home. He fixed things that needed fixing. He cooked dinner when Elena forgot to. He paid bills that arrived in her name, and he did not complain, because complaining required a belief that the situation could be different, and Daniel had, somewhere along the way, stopped believing that. He had one way of enduring it that no one in the house noticed, because it was entirely interior. He observed. He paid attention, not strategically, not with any plan in mind, but with the natural attentiveness of a man who had nothing else to occupy the part of his mind that used to be engaged by the person he married. He observed how the social machinery worked, and he observed what people revealed about themselves when they believed they were being watched only by inferiors. He observed that the most confidently cruel people tended to be the most fragile, that their cruelty was a form of reassurance, a constant need to establish hierarchy, because the hierarchy felt, somewhere in their interior lives, perpetually threatened. He did not dislike them for this. He felt, occasionally, something closer to pity. But he also filed it away, the way a man files away information he does not yet know how to use. What none of them knew, not Elena, not Constance, not the insufferable Preston, was that Daniel Mercer had a different last name than the one he'd grown up with. Or rather, that the family name he had quietly set aside when he moved to Caldwell Crossing at 22 was attached to something of staggering significance. His maternal grandfather, a man named Gerald Ashworth Mercer, had spent 40 years building an industrial conglomerate across 6 continents. Gerald had been the kind of man who got profiled in financial magazines and whose decisions moved commodity markets. He had been born poor in a small working town in the north of England and had built everything from nothing by a combination of ferocious intelligence and an almost pathological willingness to work. By his 60s, he had become the kind of wealthy that requires multiple layers of institutional management to contain. He had died 17 months ago, and he had left behind an estate that, when its full architecture was finally mapped by an army of attorneys and accountants, was valued at approximately $91 billion. Gerald had structured his legacy with extraordinary care. He had no surviving children of his own. Daniel's mother, his only child, had died in a car accident when Daniel was 14. Gerald had never fully recovered from this. He had become, in his later years, both more private and more deliberate, a man who understood that the thing he was leaving behind needed to go somewhere that mattered. He had written and rewritten the trust instruments 17 times over 2 decades. The entire estate, held across 17 shell companies and 3 sovereign trust structures, had been arranged to pass, upon Gerald's death and a quiet 3-year holding period, to his sole surviving direct descendant. And that was Daniel. Daniel had known. He had always known, in the abstract way, that a person knows something enormous and unverifiable that exists entirely outside their daily life. His grandfather had spoken to him about it once when Daniel was 19, a long afternoon conversation in Gerald's wood-panelled study in Geneva. Daniel had not thought about wealth in the way Gerald intended him to. He had gone home and gotten on with living. He had told no one. He had, for reasons he could not fully articulate even to himself, chosen to live as though the conversation had never happened, not out of denial, but out of a desire to know what a life without inherited significance actually felt like. Now he was 34, and the holding period was ending. And the world was about to find out. But first, the dinner. The occasion was Constance Whitmore's 65th birthday. She had rented the private dining room of Caldwell Crossing's most expensive restaurant. The Harrington Room, a place with linens so stiff they crackled, and a sommelier who addressed every man in the room as though they were slightly beneath him. There were 42 guests, business associates of Preston's, neighbours from Constance's social circuit, a city councilman Constance had cultivated for reasons that were not entirely clear. Elena arrived in a dress she had purchased the week before and put on the household credit card without mentioning it. Daniel had come directly from work. He had changed in the truck, clean shirt, dark trousers, the good shoes he kept in a bag under the passenger seat. He was 5 minutes late because he had stopped to help an elderly man whose car had stalled at an intersection. He slipped into the room quietly, found his seat at the far end of the table, and said hello to the 2 or 3 people he recognized. He was on his second glass of water when it happened. A waiter emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray with the wrong order, an extra plate destined for a table that hadn't asked for it. Some quiet chaos backstage. The restaurant manager, a nervous man named Roland, materialized at Constance's elbow to whisper an apology. Constance, who had been holding court in the middle of a story about her recent trip to Tuscany, did not take the interruption well. She looked down the table. She found Daniel. She found Daniel the way a person finds the least important object in a room. Not searching, not exactly, but arriving at him by a process of elimination. The way you locate a piece of furniture you want to move. "Daniel," she said, in a voice pitched precisely loud enough for the entire table to hear. "Why don't you go give Roland a hand in the back? You're good with that sort of thing." The silence that followed was the particular silence of a room where something mildly terrible has just happened in public, and no one is entirely sure whether they are obligated to acknowledge it. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Laughter. Not everyone laughed, but enough did. Preston laughed, the wide, easy laugh of a man who had never once worried about being embarrassed in public. A woman near Constance smiled in a way that she would later describe as not laughing, which was technically accurate and spiritually dishonest. Elena looked at her wine glass. Roland started to protest, and this was obviously inappropriate. He was a professional, and his restaurant had adequate staff. But Constance waved him off as though he were also a minor inconvenience. "He doesn't mind," she said. "He's used to it. He's practically a handyman." Daniel stood. His face did not change in any way that would have been visible to the table. He was aware of the 40-odd pairs of eyes that were either watching him directly or carefully on not watching him, which amounted to the same thing. He looked at Elena just for a moment. Not in appeal, not in accusation, just in the way a person looks at someone to see what they will do. She looked at her wine glass. He followed Roland toward the kitchen. He did not wash the dishes. Roland, mortified, directed him to a chair near the bread station and brought him a coffee. "I'm sorry about that," Roland said, and Daniel said it was fine, and both of them knew it wasn't. Daniel sat with his coffee and listened to the muffled sounds of the birthday dinner and felt something shift in him. Not dramatically, not like a snap, but like a lock opening. Like a mechanism that had been waiting for exactly this much pressure before it turned. He pulled out his phone. He found a contact he had not called in 3 years. He typed a single message. "I'm ready. Let's start." The response came in 47 seconds. "I'll have the first documents prepared by Monday." He finished his coffee. He straightened his shirt. He walked back into the dining room, sat down at the end of the table, and smiled pleasantly at a woman across from him who was describing her kitchen renovation. No one noticed anything had changed. Something had changed entirely. The contact Daniel had messaged was a man named Elliot Vance, a senior partner at Ashworth Mercer Holdings' primary legal firm, a quiet, methodical attorney who spoke in complete, measured sentences and whose office was aggressively tidy in the way of someone who has made peace with the fact that his life would largely be lived indoors. Elliot had been managing the trust's holding period with the patience of a man who understood that enormous things moved slowly and that trying to hurry them was the surest way to make mistakes. He had been Gerald Ashworth Mercer's attorney for 19 years. He had attended Gerald's funeral. He had managed, with considerable discretion, had the process of locating Daniel, who was not hiding exactly, but who had also made no effort to be particularly findable. He had been waiting for exactly this message. He had, in his own organized way, been prepared for it for the last 14 months. On Monday morning, Daniel drove to the city, parked the cracked mirror truck in a garage on Meridian Street, and walked into a building whose lobby was all dark marble and recessed lighting. He took an elevator to the 22nd floor. He walked through a set of glass doors into a conference room where Elliot Vance and 3 other attorneys and 2 financial analysts were already seated around a long table covered in documents. They spent 4 hours going through everything. The 17 shell companies, the trust structures, on the liquid assets, cash and bonds and public market positions totaling just over $11 billion available immediately. The remaining holdings, real estate, manufacturing interests, logistics infrastructure, energy assets across 41 countries comprising the balance of the estate's value. There were fund managers in 7 cities who had for years been managing enormous positions on behalf of instruments whose ultimate beneficiary they knew only as a trust designation. None of them knew that the beneficiary drove a cracked mirror truck and worked at a county maintenance depot. Elliot and his team had been meticulous about that. As the sole direct heir, Elliot said at one point, with the quiet precision of a man who had rehearsed this sentence 100 times, "You hold complete, unencumbered ownership. There are no competing claims. The 3-year holding period expires in 19 days. Daniel nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he is not surprised by information, but is allowing himself, for the first time, to truly feel its weight. One of the financial analysts, a young woman who had clearly been briefed on Daniel's circumstances and was trying very hard not to show that she found them extraordinary, slid a consolidated summary across the table. It was a single page. The number at the bottom was in a slightly larger font than the rest of the text, because, at a certain magnitude of figure, the eye needs a small amount of extra help. Daniel looked at it. He thought about the birthday dinner. He thought about Roland, the restaurant manager, with his apologetic coffee. He thought about the message he had sent that night. And the 47-second response. "There's one other thing," Elliot said. He slid a folder across the table. "Your grandfather, in the years before his death, made a number of investments in regional development projects along the eastern seaboard. One of those investments, made through a subsidiary 12 years ago, was the acquisition of a land parcel and commercial development site in Caldwell Crossing." Daniel opened the folder. He looked at the address. The address was the land on which the Whitmore family's primary commercial holding sat, a small retail strip that Constance had inherited from her own father and from which she drew the income that funded her social performances. The strip had been sold 12 years ago under financial pressure to a holding company whose name meant nothing to anyone in Caldwell Crossing. But that holding company was a subsidiary of an Ashworth-Mercer vehicle. The Whitmore family had been paying rent to Daniel's grandfather and now to Daniel for over a decade without knowing it. Daniel closed the folder. He was quiet for a moment in the way of a man who is processing something that goes beyond surprise into a category that doesn't have a clean name. The universe, he thought, had indeed arranged things with a very specific sense of humor. "What are the current lease terms?" Daniel asked. "Month to month," Elliot said. The previous arrangement was never formalized into a long-term lease. Oversight, or perhaps intentional flexibility. The tenants could be given 30-day notice at any point. Daniel thought about the dinner, about the apron Constance had mimed, about Elena looking at her wine glass. "I'd like to understand all of my options," he said. Over the following 2 weeks, Daniel and Elliot constructed a plan with the kind of care you apply to something that must be both just and complete. There was no cruelty in the design. Daniel was not a cruel man and he had no interest in theatre, but there was a precision to it, a quality of irrevocable accuracy. Elliot had, over the years, handled a number of situations involving significant inherited wealth and the complicated human relationships that surrounded it. He had developed a professional philosophy about such things, that the cleanest resolution was always the legally correct one, because legality, properly applied, was a form of clarity that emotional confrontation could never quite achieve. Daniel had listened to this philosophy and agreed with it, and not because he was dispassionate, he was not, but because he was by nature a man who preferred building things to breaking them, and the plan they designed was, at its core, a plan about building. The first element was straightforward. On the 19th day, when the holding period expired, ownership of the Ashworth-Mercer estate transferred officially and completely to Daniel. Elliot filed the requisite documentation with the relevant trusts and regulatory bodies. A financial announcement was prepared but not yet released. Effective that afternoon, Daniel Mercer was, in every legal and material sense, one of the wealthiest individuals alive. The second element, the Whitmore commercial property. Through the holding company, a formal notice was issued. The month-to-month tenancy arrangement would be concluded in 30 days. But the property would be undergoing redevelopment, a community housing project, as it happened, for which Daniel had already identified a non-profit developer partner he had researched during the 2 weeks since his decision. The non-profit had been looking for a site in exactly this area for 3 years. Daniel had called their executive director on a Tuesday evening, explained the situation in broad terms, and offered the site at no charge. There had been a long pause on the line. Then the executive director had said very simply, "When can we meet?" The Whitmores would need to make other arrangements. The third element was the one that would have the most immediate impact on Elena specifically. Daniel retained a family law attorney, a calm, precise woman named Sophia Ramirez, who had been recommended by Elliot for the quality of her documentation and her absolute lack of theatricality, and filed for divorce. In the filing, he declared his assets fully and accurately for the first time, as the law required. Sophia had suggested that this might cause some surprise. Surprise turned out to be a significant understatement, but Sophia was a professional, and professionals tend toward understatement. "That's fine," Daniel said. "It's important that it's accurate." Constance Whitmore received the notice about the commercial property on a Wednesday morning, and the subsequent 72 hours of her life were, by any measure, catastrophic. She called Preston immediately. Preston called the holding company, got a legal representative on the phone, demanded explanations, made vague threats. I was told calmly that the notice was fully within the terms of the existing arrangement and hung up in a state of controlled fury. He began calling commercial real estate contacts to assess alternative options and discovered that the surrounding area's rental market had tightened considerably and that nothing comparable was available at the rate the Whitmores had been paying. He spent most of that first day making calls, and by the end of it he had managed to make himself feel useful without having solved anything, which was a talent he had cultivated over many years in his professional life. Elena received the divorce filing on the same Wednesday, delivered by a process server to the house she shared with Daniel, or had shared, since Daniel had quietly taken a room in a furnished apartment 2 weeks prior, packing what he needed on 2 quiet evenings while Eleanor was at her mother's. He had not taken much. He had never accumulated much that was specifically his. The house was full of Eleanor's choices and Constance's gifts, and things that felt borrowed even when they technically belonged to both of them. He had taken his tools, his books, a few photographs, the truck, obviously. The rest he left without ceremony or grief. Elena opened the documents in the kitchen and stood for a long time without moving. The kitchen was very quiet. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a bird was making a sound in the garden, a repetitive, unconcerned sound, indifferent to legal proceedings of any kind. Eleanor read the first 2 pages, then turned to the asset disclosure, because the asset disclosure was where Sophia Ramirez had done the most honest and thorough work, and honesty had a weight to it that made itself felt even through dense legal formatting. She read it twice, then a third time. She sat down. She called her mother. "Mama," she said, in a voice that Constance would later describe as sounding unlike Elena entirely, thin and strange and very far away. "I need you to come over." Constance arrived in 20 minutes. She read the asset disclosure herself, standing at the kitchen counter because sitting felt like a concession. Then she called Preston, who drove over and read it, also standing at the kitchen counter, because this appeared to be a family trait under pressure. The number on the page was not ambiguous. It was not subject to interpretation. And it was the kind of number that does not leave room for rationalization. It was the kind of number that makes a person understand immediately and without the buffer of gradual realization that they have been operating under a fundamentally incorrect model of their world. "This isn't possible," Preston said. "It's a legal document," Eleanor said. "It could be falsified. People do that." "It was filed by 3 attorneys," Eleanor said, "with the court." Constance sat very still on the kitchen sofa, which was a thing Daniel had bought when they first moved in, and which Elena had always complained she wanted to replace. Constance was looking at the disclosure the way a person looks at a piece of evidence that requires them to fundamentally reorganize their understanding of reality. "Why wouldn't he have told you?" Constance said finally, and Elena said nothing. Preston, whose mind worked in a particular direction under pressure, immediately suggested that Elena contest the divorce and pursue the largest possible settlement. He called a friend who knew a divorce attorney. Sophia Ramirez, already several steps ahead, had anticipated this sequence precisely. She had prepared the relevant documentation and had already been in contact with the court. The legal process moved with an efficiency that surprised the Whitmore family, who had expected that money, properly applied, could create delays. What they discovered was that Daniel's team was far better resourced than their own, and had been preparing with considerable thoroughness. The settlement was structured fairly, but not generously. Eleanor was entitled to her share of the marital assets, which had been carefully documented and assessed, and she received exactly that. Not the grand fortune, not the trust, not the 17 companies and the land and the investments, the marital assets, the house for which she received her share in cash, the joint accounts. It was still more money than Elena had ever held at once, and it was nowhere near enough to make her feel better. The news about Daniel's identity did not stay contained. It never does. Elliott Vance's firm issued a formal press announcement in the normal course of business. The activation of the Ashworth Mercer Trust was a matter of public record, and within 48 hours a business journalist had connected Daniel Mercer of Caldwell Crossing to the Ashworth Mercer estate. It had done some excellent investigative work into Daniel's maintenance depot employment and his 12-year-old pickup truck and his marriage to the daughter of one Constance Whitmore, and had written a piece that was picked up by 3 national outlets and went considerably viral on the internet. The headline of the most shared version read, "Heir to $91 billion fortune, spent 6 years as the maintenance man while wife's family mocked him at dinner." It was not entirely accurate. The details, as reported, were somewhat dramatized, but it captured the essential architecture of the situation with brutal fidelity. The Harrington Room birthday dinner was mentioned specifically. A source, unnamed, had provided some detail about the kitchen incident. The article noted that Daniel's estranged wife's family had for years referred to him dismissively by his occupation. Constance Whitmore read the article in the reading room of the Caldwell Crossing Public Library because her home internet was briefly out, and she read it on a library computer surrounded by strangers, with her name appearing in the 4th paragraph. She did not handle it with composure. Preston, who was in the middle of a client meeting when his phone began to vibrate continuously for the first time in his professional life, stepped out to check it and discovered that several of his commercial real estate clients had seen the article and had questions. Not hostile questions precisely, but the kind of questions a person asks when they want to signal that they have noticed something and that it has changed their assessment of a relationship. He lost 2 clients by end of business that day. Elena had been staying with Constance since leaving the house. She read the article in the morning on her phone, still in bed, and spent a very long time staring at the ceiling. She thought about the kitchen and the process server and the asset disclosure and the wine glass she had stared at instead of her husband's face on the night of her mother's birthday dinner. She thought about all of the moments she could identify now with the particular clarity available only in retrospect, where she had made choices that seemed strategic at the time and that she understood now had been simply small and short-sighted and unkind. She did not call Daniel. She knew with complete certainty that the number she had for him would either be unanswered or answered by someone who had already moved on. She was right on both counts. The confrontation that the Whitmore family might have imagined, a dramatic, recriminatory scene in a lawyer's office or a family home, with accusations flying and Daniel standing above the ruin of their social pretensions, did not occur in that form. Daniel was not interested in dramatic confrontations. What he was interested in was a specific meeting arranged by Elliott Vance at the offices of the Ashworth Mercer legal team, to which Constance Whitmore's attorney had requested access in connection with the commercial property notice. Constance arrived with her attorney and with Preston, who had not been invited but came anyway, which said a great deal about Preston. They were shown into a conference room that was not quite as large as the one on the 22nd floor, but was still considerably more imposing than anything the Whitmore family habitually occupied. They waited for 11 minutes. Then Daniel walked in. He was wearing a dark suit that fit him well. His hair was the same as it always was. He looked rested. He sat down across from them, and he thanked their attorney for arranging the meeting, and he apologized for the wait. Constance's attorney began a prepared statement about the property notice and the disruption to her client's commercial interests, and the long-standing nature of the tenancy arrangement, and the absence of formal written notice beyond the 30 days legally required. Daniel listened to all of it. He nodded occasionally. When it was done, he turned to Elliott, ours who produced a counter-brief that addressed each point with a specificity and a depth that made the Whitmore attorney visibly recalibrate his assessment of the room. Then Daniel looked at Constance directly. It was not a cold look precisely. It was the look of someone who has thought about this moment for a long time and has decided to keep it simple. "Constance," he said, "I want to be honest with you because I think honesty is overdue in this family. I spent 6 years in your orbit, and you made your opinion of me very clear, not always in large moments, mostly in small ones. The looks, the jokes, the assumptions. I wasn't what you had in mind for your daughter, and you were never subtle about it." Constance's jaw tightened. "I'm not here to revisit all of that," Daniel continued. I don't have any interest in punishment for its own sake, but I also have no interest in maintaining arrangements that don't serve the purpose I'd like this asset to serve. The property has been identified for community redevelopment. That decision has been made. The 30-day notice stands. "You're doing this out of spite," Preston said, with the particular conviction of someone who would absolutely do something out of spite and therefore assumed everyone else would. "I'm doing it," Daniel said, "because I own the property and I've decided what to use it for. You're welcome to consult your attorney about whether there are grounds for a legal challenge. There aren't, but I understand you'll want to verify that." Preston opened his mouth. He looked at Constance's attorney. The attorney, Kiku had by now read all of Elliot's counterbrief, gave a very small, honest shake of his head. Preston closed his mouth. Constance, who was not an unintelligent woman and who understood in her bones that she had arrived in this room at a profound disadvantage, straightened in her chair. There was something almost admirable in it. The way she recollected herself, the way she tried to locate the dignity of her position. "You could have simply told us," she said, "told Elena." "Yes," Daniel said. "I could have. I chose not to. I wanted to understand what my life looked like without it." He paused. "I think I found out." He stood. He thanked her attorney again. He shook hands with Elliot. He walked out of the conference room and through the glass doors and into the elevator and down to the lobby where his driver was waiting, and he did not look back. In the months that followed, Daniel's life reorganized itself around its new center with a quiet, purposeful energy. He had never been interested in ostentation. The 12-year-old truck had not been a performance of poverty. It had been a genuine preference for simplicity, and that did not change. He moved into a house that was comfortable without being excessive, in a neighborhood where people said hello on the street and where the trees were old enough to provide real shade in the summer. He kept his life small in the ways that mattered to him, his own company, a few close friendships, the satisfaction of work that had meaning. He retained 4 employees from the county maintenance depot. Not as charity, he had explained that clearly, but because he had worked alongside them for years and knew their quality. He brought them on to the Foundation's facilities team, where they would manage the properties the Foundation was developing and maintaining. They accepted with varying degrees of astonishment. One of them, a man named Curtis, who had worked alongside Daniel for 9 of the past 11 years, took Daniel for a beer and spent most of it staring at him with an expression of profound philosophical revision. "You are the least dramatic person I have ever met," Curtis said finally. "I mean that as the highest possible compliment." Daniel said he'd take it. The meaning now was significant. With Elliot's guidance and a team of advisors he assembled carefully over several months, Daniel established the Ashworth Mercer Community Foundation. Its mandate was workforce development and affordable housing in underserved communities, things that his grandfather had cared about, and that Daniel had spent enough years in physical labor to understand were not abstract social goods, but actual, daily conditions of people's lives. Its first major project was the redevelopment of the Caldwell Crossing site, the very property the Whitmores had occupied, into a mixed-use affordable housing and workforce training centre. A local non-profit architect designed it. Ground was broken on a Tuesday morning in late spring. Daniel was there in work clothes because the contractor had asked if he wanted to operate the first excavator. And Daniel, who had driven heavy equipment at the maintenance depot and genuinely enjoyed it, I said yes without hesitation. He was photographed on the excavator by a journalist from the regional paper, grinning, and the photo was shared widely because it was that kind of photo. A man who was worth nearly $100 billion sitting in a construction machine, looking like a man who was exactly where he wanted to be. He had met someone quietly a few months earlier. Her name was Mara, a civil engineer who worked on municipal infrastructure and who had been consulted on the site's utility layout. She was direct and technically precise and had a way of laughing at things that were actually funny without doing so at things that weren't, which Daniel had come to understand was a rarer quality than it sounded. She did not perform warmth. She simply was warm. In the unglamorous way of someone who was genuinely interested in other people. She had not known who he was for the first 3 weeks they knew each other, because Daniel had not told her, and she had not recognized his name from the news coverage. When she found out, not from him, but from a colleague who saw his photo in the paper and put it together, she had called him and said, in a very direct tone, that she needed to know whether he had omitted this information on purpose. Yes, he said. Why? Same reason as the last time, he said. I wanted to know what it looked like without it. There was a pause on the line. That's fair, she said. But you could have told me. I know, he said. I'm telling you now. They had dinner that Friday. They had dinner the Friday after that, and he appreciated the way she said what she thought without performance. She appreciated the way he listened, the deep, undistractable quality of his attention, without knowing, yet, that this was a thing he had spent 6 years learning to do because no one in his home had bothered to develop it. They were not in a hurry about anything. That, too, felt right. The Whitmore family's trajectory was less peaceful. Constance's commercial properties having lost their primary holding, she was forced to downsize her social operations considerably. The charity luncheons became fewer, the neighborhood association meetings continued, but with diminished prestige, because prestige in Caldwell Crossing was partly a function of resources and Constance's resources had contracted. Yet she remained in the area and remained herself, stubborn and image-conscious, and convinced on some level that the situation had been fundamentally unfair to her. And she and Daniel moved through the same small city with the elaborate, negotiated invisibility of two people who had reached an unspoken agreement not to collide. She never apologized. He never expected her to. Preston lost a third client over the following quarter, in circumstances unrelated to the article, but in a professional climate that had shifted subtly around him. The commercial real estate world was not large, and reputation, once dinged, required sustained effort to repair. Effort that Preston, who had spent most of his career coasting on a veneer of confidence rather than earned credibility, was not well positioned to make. And he eventually moved to a different city and started over with somewhat reduced ambitions, which may have been, in the long run, a healthy development. Reduced ambitions, properly calibrated, are not the same as failure. Preston had simply spent too long confusing the two. Elena, to her credit, did not attempt to re-enter Daniel's life. She used her settlement money to pay off debts and to take a position at a non-profit in the city, where she discovered that she was quite capable, in contexts where capability was valued without the constant performance of status. The work was grant administration, unglamorous, detail-intensive, frequently frustrating, and she found that she was good at it in a way she had not expected to be good at anything. She was not happy in the immediate sense, but she was functioning, and functioning honestly, which was more than she had been doing for most of her marriage. She thought about Daniel occasionally, not with bitterness. She had been thorough enough in her self-examination to understand that bitterness would have been its own form of dishonesty, but with a quality of regret that she suspected would be with her for a long time. That seemed right to her. Some things should stay with you. Daniel, on a Saturday afternoon in the autumn of the year his new life began in earnest, drove out to the small cemetery on the edge of town where no one he knew was buried, sat on a bench near the old stone wall and thought about his grandfather. He thought about the afternoon in Geneva. He thought about what Gerald had said, not about the money specifically, but about the nature of the thing. The question isn't what you have, Gerald had said, in the slow way of old men who have thought about a thing for many decades. The question is whether you know who you are when it isn't there. Daniel had been 19 and had not fully understood it. He understood it now. He understood it the way you understand something that you have lived through, rather than merely read about. With your whole body, from the inside. He sat for a while. The light moved through the trees in the particular way of autumn, gold and transient and honest. He felt for the first time in a very long time that his life was organized correctly, that its weight was distributed the way he would have chosen if someone had asked him at the beginning how he wanted to live. No one had asked, but it had turned out that way regardless. But he drove home in the pickup truck. He still had it. Elliot had gently suggested more than once that perhaps a vehicle with functioning mirrors might be appropriate. Daniel had replaced the mirror. There were limits, but kept the truck. He liked it. It had character. It had history. It had done nothing wrong. What would you have done in Daniel's position? When the opportunity came to use everything you had accumulated quietly and invisibly, would you have spent it on thunder, or on something that would still be standing long after the noise faded? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. True power isn't found in the things we display or the social rungs we climb. It lives in the patience of those who know exactly who they are when no one is watching, and the quiet certainty that when the right moment finally arrives, they won't need to raise their voice at all. Daniel Mercer spent 6 years being told he was nothing. He used those years to become entirely certain of everything. And in the end, the people who had dismissed him most loudly became the proof of his point. If this story resonated with you, make sure to hit that like button. It helps this channel find the people who need to hear stories like this. And I'll see you in the next video.